Another tutorial to level up your fur drawing skills. But this time it focuses on 5 tricks that push your fur from looking good to looking amazing. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend checking it out before continuing this tutorial. It covers the most important rules that make good looking fur, while this video focuses on these hidden techniques that can make your fur look really nice. So if you haven't watched it, please do. Click the link up on the screen or in the description below. Of course, it is all up to you whether you want to implement the tips of this video or not. I genuinely just want to help in any way I can. Let's not waste any more time and get to the tutorial. The most important thing is line art and line emphasis. Basically, the thickness of your line art and how much you allow it to stand out. Paying attention to these aspects can make a huge difference. Not only does the art look less crowded, but it also allows you to focus on the most important features of your character. Some of your fur should be considered as background elements, meaning that you won't notice they are there until they are not. What I'm really saying is that they can't compete against the more important fur lines. You achieve this by either having 2 different brush sizes, control over your pen pressure, or erasing parts of your fur. Line emphasis is something that many professional artists use. Just take a look at anime illustrations. But what fur should be less noticeable though? I'd say general fur lines that do not make up the silhouette of your character, for example, but still need to add some kind of shape. Or the few extra fur tufts next to the more important ones. I generally reduce the thickness of the fur line art in the face of my wolves, so the lines do not distract the viewer too much. I also use this technique when I'm drawing cats or birds. You can basically apply this to anything that you draw with line art. The second tip is adding another fur size to your art. I already covered the importance of having different sizes present in your fur patterns in the other tutorial. The general rule of having 1 big piece of fur and 2 or 3 smaller ones is important here. But if you were to apply this type of fur all over the body, you will risk it becoming overly detailed. On top of that, it might also give the impression that your character is having extra long fur everywhere. Yet if you do not draw the fur, you might feel like your character misses some detail on the body. There's a way to fix both of these scenarios. Start introducing smaller fur lines like this. It is a technique commonly used in anime, and when I was working on an animated project for a client, we even implemented this in the style guide. Fur like this is less in your face and looks like it could be actual fur. Use it in combination with the other sizes to make your fur look truly dynamic and divide your fur into sections for clarity. The drawing exercises from the previous tutorial help with this a lot. Just remember to pay attention to my first tip about the line thickness. Good looking fur is not only achieved by good line art, but also good shading. Shading styles vary per artist. There are multiple ways to approach it, but for now I will focus on cell shading with specific tricks to make it look polished. I will only be covering the way I shade my fur and not the light sources and the basic principles of shading in general. The good thing is that a lot of the fur line art rules also apply to fur shading. Different sizes of fur shadows need to be applied and detail should be added accordingly. You do not draw every single line of fur, so you also do not shade every single piece of fur. Unless that is your art style, then by all means go for it. But it will take a lot of time and patience, something that I do not always have. Shading your fur becomes easier if you have previously divided your fur into sections. If you aren't sure how many or where to add these groups of fur, you can take a look at my personal style on this. I am not saying that this is the way to do it, but I found out that this was the easiest and best suits my style. Just make sure not to make these sections too small. When I start shading pieces of fur like this, I generally start at the top and follow the line art as a guide. I usually leave the ends of my shadows pointy because it will most likely be covered by another piece of fur on top. Something that you do not have to draw, but you can always suggest its presence. I tend to avoid too many separate shading lines on one tuft of fur. 1 or 2 is my sweet spot. If I started adding more, it will look like I tried to fit in too many shading strokes into one big tuft of fur. If you have done your line art correctly, it should be able to guide you during your shading process. Just to give a very clear example, here is the general shape that we draw for fur. I recommend following the same shape while you make the shadows. I did not always let the line art guide where my shading should go and started filling in random shapes of fur. The reason why I'm not doing this anymore is because it takes a lot of time. It also made my fur look very crowded and I felt like I couldn't get the depth of the fur exactly how I wanted it to be. But fur like this on its own doesn't look too bad, right? Well, this is only one piece. Imagine having all of these patterns on your character. So that would mean that we would have to multiply this by 10. Now it looks a lot more crowded. Simply following your line art and adding less shading strokes can make it look like fur already. Now, if you shade like I showed you, you will probably end up with something like this. Here's a tip that most artists tend to forget or just not think about, even though it can add so much to your art piece. It is bounce light. Light on your subject does not only come directly from the sun as the light source, but can also come from underneath. It is the light that bounces upwards, so to speak. You usually add it where your shadows are. So, if I were to take an eraser and carefully erase small strokes of the shadow at the bottom of the fur, you already have something that looks like bounce light. You do not have to add it to every single piece of fur, but it will look nice on the main ones. Just make sure to not erase the entire shading. If the eraser tool is not doing it for you, you could also make a new layer with your preferred blend mode and paint in the bounce light on top of the shadows. A blend mode that I usually use is soft light. Now, if you do not want to use the eraser or blend modes, you could also simply take the color of the light that hits your fur from below and paint it on top. I recommend using blend modes or the eraser though. It saves a lot of time and it is fun to experiment with the different options. Here is the last tip of the tutorial video and it can be applied in just a few seconds. I never leave my line art as a solid black, but rather choose a darker version of the fur color. In this case, I would pick a darker blue or a red. These colors tend to blend in with your art better than the solid black. So what is it that you can take away from this tutorial? Here is a quick summary. 1. Have a balance between thick and thin line art. 2 is start adding simplified fur patterns instead of going full detail all over your character. 3. When adding shadows, be mindful of the amount of detail and how many shading lines you try to fit into one tuft of fur. 4. Polish your shadows afterwards with bounce light at the parts you want to stand out. And 5. Color your line art instead of having a solid black. Some of these tips are easy to implement, such as the line art color. Others might take a bit of practice. I hope this tutorial was helpful and that you learned something new. Let me know what you would like to see next. Until next week. Bye.